I'm Scott Phoenix. I'm a partner here at 50 Years, and I'm here really because I learned a long time ago that all of our fates are far more shared than they are separate. Regardless of what any of us achieves individually in our own lives, the life we get to live is mostly going to be like the life that the rest of Team Human is living at around the same time. And because we're all in this together, those of us who have a high degree of agency have an opportunity and a responsibility to help shape the kind of future that we all get to share. Because as people, we have to live one day at a time, it's a little bit difficult to appreciate how fast things change. And I thought a fun way to bypass that would be just to experience together 200 years of progress in 45 seconds. And so let's enjoy that. Okay, so I think there's two really interesting things about that video. The first one is that if I showed you a 200-year period of history and all the progress we made during it, during any other period of history, it would be a really boring video because nothing would happen. And the other thing that I think is really interesting about that video is virtually all the progress that you saw in it is due to GPTs, and not the GPTs that Karpathy is going to teach you about, but the old GPTs, the acronym that economists use for general purpose technologies. And if you look at everything in that 45-second clip, virtually all of the technologies there are downstream of just three really massive general purpose technologies. And they are engines, electricity, and computers. When we look at GPTs, they are humanity's biggest lever for progress. They have been empirically, and it's likely to continue. The second thing is these new GPTs that we're facing now, namely AI, humanoid robotics, and synthetic biology, may actually dwarf all of the previous GPTs in their size. And there's some ways we can estimate that, and we can have that conversation today. And then the final thing is, because we've been through this show before, with electricity, with engines, and so on, there are lessons that we can learn from how past GPTs have reshaped society, what are the tensions, and how to strike a balance. And so, as an opening today, I thought it'd be fun to walk through those past GPTs, talk about the lessons that we've learned from them, and how they might apply to the GPTs we face now. So it all started with a steam engine. For most of human history, we converted our muscles into work. And in the 1800s, we figured out how to finally convert fuel into work instead. And that's what brought us from an agrarian economy to an industrial economy. We built the first factories, steamships, railroads. And of course, as we do with every technology, we made it smaller. We moved it from being a giant, very slow to start steam engine to an instant start, a very small internal combustion engine, which let automobiles come to take hold. And by the end of the 20s, 1 in 5 households had a car. And the second order effects of this are really interesting because all that petroleum that was going into the cars then made possible the petrochemicals industry. And so we got nylon, and we got plastics, and we got a highway system. All of these things are the kind of downstream second order effects of us having an internal combustion engine. And then, of course, we extended it into the sky, into the stars, and across the oceans. And we did this exercise where we looked at data from the Bureau of Economic Analysis of all the different industries, and we did our best to trace back which industries or what percent of the industries are possible without an engine. And the answer is basically none of them. So if we didn't have that first invention, we would all be living the lives of subsistence farmers with like horses and cows, pulling plows. The next big GPT in the story here is electricity. This is the dynamo. You basically take a magnet and you rotate a copper disc through it. And the interesting thing here is how well that connects with the engine. Because the engine turns fuel into rotation. The dynamo turns rotation into continuous electricity. And that's the basic principle that all the power plants used even today. This is the first power plant in New York City. And electricity was only really valuable after Edison perfected the electric light bulb. In the early 10s and 20s, we electrified the country, and we used it to light factories so that we could have continuous work happening almost at all hours. And that was the first big improvement in productivity from electricity. But things really got interesting when we reworked the factory by using small electric motors to allow us to structure the production line rather than around what needs power, but around the order of operations that are done to produce the objects. Electricity also gave birth to the telegraph and the telecommunications industry, television, telephones, household appliances. And when you look at the same counterfactual exercise of like what percentage of the economy would we be able to create without electricity, the answer is of course very massive. And then the last one was computers. So in the 40s, we invented the first computers. We had them before the 40s. It was just a job and not a machine. Then, of course, we made them smaller, like we did the engines. We put them in every home, every office, hospital, and so on, connect them all together. You guys did the story here, and it gave birth to the software industry. And this is the transition to a knowledge economy. And repeating the exercise here, we get to the percentage of overall GDP driven by computers. And I think this is interesting because it's a little different from the analysis you usually see. The normal analysis you see is about what percentage of the overall economy is software or is telecom or something. And that actually underestimates it because the question we're asking is what percentage of the economy is enabled or counterfactually wouldn't exist without this technology. Okay, so these are the kind of past levers that have moved humanity forward. And we're entering this new era now. And I think we can draw some really important lessons of what's happened in the previous three to help us understand how to relate to the next two. And I think there's some compelling arguments to be made about the size of the next two and the level of impact they might have. And particularly, it comes in two forms. It comes in how fast they arrive and what is the terminal size of each of these. We can reason about speed. There's lots of data on the adoption rates of past inventions, and you can look at the graph for 5 seconds and get what the trend is here. Every invention is much faster to be adopted than the previous ones. I think the easy way to understand that is what makes an invention possible is some foundational discovery, some core invention. But before it really transforms society, it needs to become viable by improvements in reliability. It needs to become valuable by having maybe some complementary inventions or existing demand. And then finally, you need distribution channels. And that becomes the gating function for how fast a GPT can transform society. And so if you look at electricity, it became possible in the 1830s, but not really viable until the late 1800s when we had AC transmission and transformers. And so the overall end-to-end on electricity's impact is like 100 years. Whereas if you look at something like AI, because we already had all the pieces here, you could go from ChatGPT's launch to 100 million users in 2 months. And the question we have to ask ourselves when we look at the new GPTs is, what are the bottlenecks? And what is the speed at which we could expect each of these to infiltrate society and create disruption or benefit? And it's a little bit different for AI and humanoids than it is for synthetic biology. So we'll talk at it one at a time. For AI and humanoid robots, you have to think historically about what were the rate limiters for physical and knowledge work automation. In the case of each, for electricity, to automate a knowledge work task, you had to have a mechanical engineer design a specialized machine to do that task. And similarly, for the knowledge revolution, you had to have a specialized software engineer design a piece of software for that task. And what makes this a really interesting moment is instead of having specialized machines for every task and specialized software for every task, we have a single machine for many tasks, maybe not all of them, but many tasks in the form of a humanoid robot. And we also have a single piece of software in the form of a large pre-trained neural network instead of many different programs. The bottleneck switches from being driven by the number of trained humans and how many hours a day they sleep to the bottleneck being driven by other factors like energy. That conversation is, I think, one that moves maybe at regulatory speeds. Perhaps that's the answer to this, although regulatory speeds tend to get pretty short in times of war or great conflict. And I think there's, in terms of the actual capabilities themselves, I think there's reasons for skepticism about this future being as fast and as exciting as some people think it is, which is perhaps there are capability gaps, fundamental issues at the heart of these large models that just aren't bridgeable with more scale. And similarly, robots are hard to build. Like interacting with the physical world is challenging. You looked at Waymo and the adventure from when Waymo started and how soon they thought they would have self-driving cars till now today you can hail one. It was a long road. I also think there's reasons for hope. So people argue today about how the AI progress has not let up. Everybody who bet against these large models and GPUs going burr has died, basically. They have lost the bet. And so, same thing with humanoids. There's so many companies now building humanoid robots, and there's a big push behind this technology. And so there's an interesting discussion to be had about how that plays out. Synthetic biology is also really interesting. The way I like to think about synthetic biology is you have to imagine that the human race crashed on an alien planet. And we get to the planet, and we look around, and the whole planet is covered in the most advanced technology we've ever seen. It's like 1,000 times smaller than anything we can engineer ourselves. It's 100 times more energy efficient. It self-assembles, it self-repairs, and it's powered by sunlight and sugar, which is actually Earth and all the life that exists in biology. So like it's a tech tree that is one leap beyond our very primitive ways of making integrated circuits and making mechanical parts today. And if we can understand how to harness it, we can produce motors and all of the things that we use in our day-to-day lives using this alternative tech tree, and they're much more performant. This is the motor that powers a bacterial flagella, and it's way more precise than anything you could possibly pay someone to build for you today. And we have our first turns of doing this, right? So we have mRNA vaccines, we have solugens doing enzymatic chemical synthesis, and when we went to model out what are the GDP implications of this kind of technology reaching scale, the answer is just things get weird, frankly, because if you think about it, like one of the speakers today is going to be talking about partial epigenetic reprogramming, which is a mechanism by which you can kind of reverse age someone's cells in someone's body. And so imagine this succeeds, and we live in a world where people are perpetually between 30 and 40 years old. What happens to the demand for healthcare and assisted services? And so like a big chunk of our economy is spent on things that are designed to help people in their 70s and 80s and 90s. And if that evaporates, because and same thing with pharmaceuticals, like most of the diseases that we treat with pharmaceuticals are actually at the base level diseases of aging. And so would that shrink GDP if that were to happen? It's a great question, because we spend less money than what we do now. Because we've been through a few of the turns of the wheel before, we can use lessons from past GDPs to help us navigate what's happening in the near future. I think it's helpful to take a look at some of the last technologies that came to transform our present society, or have the potential to, and talk about commonalities between them. There's a couple of very basic key ingredients. So for each of these, they were top-down, relatively simple ideas in underfunded areas that had massive externalities. And we'll unpack these one at a time. So top-down ideas, if you ask people what they want, they'll tell you faster horses, but what they really need is a car. And so for each of these ideas, whether it was deep learning or CUDA, these were ideas that everyone sort of dismissed. It was a weird backwater of people working on them. I remember my co-founder at Vicarious told me when he took Bernard Widrow's deep learning class, there were like 20 people in it, and like half of them were auditing it. It was just, people had no confidence in that technology's ability to solve real problems. And so these technologies that come to reshape the world are not popular, and the work that happens in them is driven by people having conviction about a future that they want to construct, and the promise of this technology's path to creating that future. The second is that there's generally simple ideas. You take enough laptop batteries and you add wheels and you get a car, or you take the uridine and you replace it with pseudo-uridine and the body doesn't reject the mRNA anymore. So it's not like a galaxy brain collection of 7 PhD theses coming together. These are relatively simple ideas. And the last thing is they're generally in underfunded areas. So if you look at how much we spend per year in the economy on SaaS or on concrete manufacturing, and then you look at how much as a venture community are we investing in each of these areas, and then just take the ratio, there's a wild difference here. For every $1 invested in SaaS companies, they're all fighting over the same $32 a year of revenue, whereas for every $1 invested in concrete manufacturing, it's $1,400 of market demand. And also we have to put it in context of technology tailwinds, where when the rules change, that tends to unlock something. So it's these key ingredients, and I think the interesting thing about this is this list, you can apply this list to itself. So this is a top-down, simple idea in an underfunded area, which is thinking about what you do before you do it, that has positive externalities. The last thing is the externalities piece. So normally, if you're in business school or you're running a company, someone proposes an idea, they do the classic analysis where they're like, okay, what's the CAGR of the market that you're entering? And then they say, okay, how much can we improve the cost of making whatever it is, widgets per year? And so then we'll keep selling widgets at the market rate with that improvement, and then we'll capture the green triangle of value until the competitors figure out how we did it and take away our differentiation. And that's the value that we're going to chase. And the problem with this is that you get companies like Joule, which create maybe the same amount of value as somebody who's starting an AI doctor, but the externalities of it are massively negative. And so by looking at the externalities, the benefits to society more broadly is how we get to a transformed world. So these are the sort of key ingredients to think about. And I'd say the last one is, I think we're very far from the Pareto frontier of what we could be building if more capable people chose more ambitious quests. Like, I get a little depressed when I see the lists of startups coming out because so many of them are insufficiently ambitious and they're not sort of societal infrastructure that we could be building. This is Richard Hamming. He ran Bell Labs and worked on the Manhattan Project. And he always used to take new researchers out to lunch and he'd ask them 3 questions. What are the most important problems in your field? What are you working on? And why are the 2 different? And I feel like as builders, we should ask ourselves the same questions. So, here we are. How amazing. Like, are we, ready for the next golden age? It's worth looking at a picture of the last group of people who went through the period of the most explosive GDP growth in history and the most explosive technological change in history. Do you notice that they're holding signs and they look a little sad or maybe even angry? And the point of this is that progress is more than just technology. So we can't just build awesome new toys or new tools. We need widespread economic prosperity. When you look at past golden ages, there's 3 key ingredients. There's widespread economic prosperity, there's effective and accountable institutions, and there's also social cohesion and cooperation. And how are we doing on our scorecard here? I think the answer is not great. Our trust in government is at an all-time low. The majority of Americans think the system is rigged, and we're increasingly polarized. We disagree with each other more. I imagine if there was a 2024 update to this picture, the 2 red and blue humps would barely touch each other. And not only do we dislike the other party, we dislike each other. It's gotten very personal and very toxic. It's just such a shocking change to hear how many people would be displeased if someone married someone from the other party. And so not only do we dislike each other, dislike our systems, they also dislike technology. Like, I think broadly speaking, Americans have become very pessimistic about the future and fearful of technology. And this is something that in the past has been very dangerous to progress. So like you think about nuclear power, people became scared of the technology and we basically stopped building it for 50 years. And that can happen unless we make choices that help society get behind the idea of progress. So some things for us to think about together in this room. I think there's a spectrum that we live on in the future between a golden age and the French Revolution 2.0. Somewhere in that spectrum is where our future lies. And I think the decisions of people in this room and the decisions of people 1 degree separate from this room are going to have a lot of valence on which future that is. And so I invite you all to have some hard conversations today about what that might be and what initiatives we can take on ourselves to take more responsibility for shaping that future. We've segmented the day into 3 buckets. The first is institutions. So we're going to talk about the economics of progress and also the role of the West and Western democracies in shaping frontiers. Then we're going to look at the frontiers themselves, and then finally we'll look at some lessons in building ambitious projects from Sam and Mark. So yeah, thanks for coming. Welcome to Progress Valley.